The wind howled across the prairie like a lonely wolf, dragging ribbons of dust across the empty road that led into the town of Red Hollow. And at the edge of that town, where the land rose into a small hill overlooking the valley, there stood a single wooden cross, weathered by sun and storm, leaning just enough to look tired of standing alone. And beside that cross every evening sat a woman in a faded blue dress and a coat that had once belonged to a soldier, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she expected the road itself to bring someone back. And the townsfolk passed by with quiet glances and hushed whispers, because everyone in Red Hollow knew the story of the woman who waited beside the cross, and they also believed the man she waited for had been gone too long to ever return. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and once upon a time her laughter had filled the dusty streets of Red Hollow the same way church bells filled Sunday mornings, but that was before the war rode through their lives like a thunderstorm, tearing through dry grass, before the trains carried young men eastward toward gunsmoke and cannon fire, before the man she loved kissed her goodbye beneath the cottonwood tree by the river and promised he would come back. And that man was Daniel Mercer, a rancher with steady hands and quiet eyes who believed more in promises than in luck. And the morning he left, Clara stood at the train platform gripping the sleeve of his coat, while the whistle screamed and the iron monster breathed clouds into the sky. And Daniel pressed something into her hand before climbing aboard, a small silver coin he carried for good fortune, whispering that if she kept it safe he would follow it home. The cross on the hill had not always been there, because before the war that patch of land held nothing but tall prairie grass and a crooked fence. But one autumn afternoon a telegram arrived in Red Hollow with black ink that carried more weight than a rifle, and the letter said Daniel Mercer had fallen in battle somewhere far beyond the rivers and forests of the eastern states. And the words struck Clara like lightning splitting a tree, leaving her standing in the street, unable to breathe, while the town preacher read the message again with trembling hands. And that same evening Clara climbed the hill with a hammer, a plank of wood, and tears she refused to show anyone. And by moonlight she built a cross with her own hands, carving Daniel's name into it with a pocket knife, while the wind whispered through the grass. At first the townspeople believed grief would fade the way storm clouds fade after rain. But Clara returned to the hill the next evening, and the evening after that, and every sunset after that, sitting beside the cross as if guarding a doorway between worlds, sometimes speaking softly to the wood as though Daniel might hear her through the grain, sometimes simply watching the horizon where the road twisted through the prairie like a dusty snake. And the sheriff, old Thomas Hale, rode past her one day and tipped his hat gently, telling her she ought to rest and come back to town. But Clara only smiled in a quiet way and said Daniel had promised to come home, and promises were not things she buried. Red Hollow itself had the kind of silence that followed war, a strange quiet that settled into buildings and barns like dust that never quite swept away, because many of the men who left on those trains never came back, and the ones who did carried shadows in their eyes that even whiskey could not drown, and the saloon no longer rang with the same loud laughter it once had. But every evening when the sun dipped low, the townsfolk would glance toward the hill and see Clara sitting beside that lonely cross, the hem of her dress stirring in the wind, and some people called her devoted, while others whispered she had lost her mind. Yet no one dared mock her openly, because there was something about the way she waited that made even the toughest cowboys feel small. Among those who watched her was Samuel Briggs, the blacksmith whose forge glowed red through the night like a stubborn star. And Samuel had known Daniel since they were boys chasing cattle along the riverbank, and he remembered the way Daniel spoke about Clara as if she were the best thing the world had ever made. So one evening Samuel climbed the hill carrying a lantern and a blanket, offering them to Clara as the cold crept across the prairie, and she thanked him kindly but told him she already had what she needed, pointing to Daniel's old coat wrapped around her shoulders, the sleeves too long but warm enough to remind her of the man who once wore it. And Samuel nodded slowly before walking back down the hill with the uneasy feeling that Clara's faith was stronger than the truth they had all accepted. Winter came early that year, rolling over the plains in grey clouds that swallowed the sun and buried the grass beneath hard frost. Yet Clara still climbed the hill each day, her boots crunching through frozen soil as she carried a small lantern and a thermos of coffee, and the cross grew coated with thin sheets of ice that sparkled like glass whenever the weak sunlight touched it. And sometimes travelers passing through Red Hollow stopped their wagons to ask about the woman on the hill, and the townsfolk would explain the story with a mixture of sadness and respect, because even strangers could see there was something sacred in her waiting, as if love itself had taken human form and refused to move. Then one evening near the end of winter, when the sky burned red with the last light of sunset and the wind carried the distant sound of hoofbeats across the valley, Clara sat beside the cross holding the silver coin Daniel had given her years before, rubbing it between her fingers the way some people rub prayer beads. And far beyond the hills, a lone rider moved slowly along the dusty road leading toward Red Hollow, his hat pulled low and his coat heavy with travel. A man who had crossed battlefields and deserts and rivers to follow a promise back home. And though Clara could not yet see his face in the fading light, something in her heart stirred like the first breath of spring after a brutal winter, as if the prairie itself were whispering that some stories were not finished yet. The sun was sinking low behind the western hills, painting the prairie in shades of fire and copper, and Clara Whitmore sat beside the wooden cross the way she had every evening for years, her fingers wrapped around the small silver coin Daniel had once placed in her hand, the metal worn smooth from endless days of waiting. And just as the last ribbon of daylight stretched across the valley, she saw a speck moving along the far road, a lone rider cutting slowly through the dust like a shadow refusing to fade. And though travelers sometimes passed that way, her heart suddenly began to beat with a strange and restless rhythm, because something about the way that horse moved, steady and stubborn against the wind, stirred a memory she had carried deep inside her chest since the day Daniel Mercer rode away to war. Down in the town of Red Hollow the evening lamps were flickering to life, and the men sitting outside the saloon watched the same rider approach through the haze of drifting dust, their eyes narrowing as if the past itself were riding toward them on horseback, because the man leaned forward in the saddle with the tired patience of someone who had crossed more miles than he cared to remember, and his coat hung heavy with road grime, while his hat shadowed a face weathered by years the prairie had never seen. And Samuel Briggs the blacksmith stepped out from his forge, wiping soot from his hands, squinting toward the road with a puzzled look, because something about the stranger's silhouette reminded him of a man he once knew long before war swallowed half the town. The rider slowed his horse near the edge of Red Hollow, looking around at the familiar buildings as if each one carried a memory waiting to be confirmed. And the wooden storefronts stood exactly where he remembered them, though age had carved deeper lines into their boards. The barber pole creaked in the wind beside the general store, and the sign above the saloon swung lazily on rusted chains, and the man's eyes lingered on each detail like someone walking through a dream that might vanish if he blinked too quickly, because the truth was, he had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the long nights of war, wondering whether the town would still exist, wondering whether anyone would remember his name, wondering most of all whether the woman he loved had truly believed the letter claiming he had died. Far above the town on the lonely hill, Clara rose slowly from the ground as the rider came closer, brushing dust from the hem of her dress, while the wind tugged gently at Daniel's old coat around her shoulders, and though distance still blurred the stranger's features, she felt an unexplainable pull in her chest, the same quiet certainty she had carried every day she climbed that hill, and she whispered Daniel's name softly beneath her breath, like a prayer carried by the evening breeze, because the promise he had made years ago had never faded from her heart. And deep down she had always believed the war might steal time and hope in men's lives, but it could never truly erase a promise spoken beneath an open sky. The truth of Daniel Mercer's story had been buried beneath confusion and smoke on a battlefield hundreds of miles away, where cannon fire roared so loud men could not hear their own voices, and the air smelled of burning earth and iron. And during one brutal charge Daniel had been thrown from his horse, when an explosion ripped through the line of soldiers beside him, leaving him unconscious among the fallen while chaos swallowed the field. And when the wounded were gathered later by a passing regiment, no one bothered to check the names carefully. So Daniel Mercer was listed among the dead, and the telegram sent west carried the wrong truth to Red Hollow, while Daniel himself awoke days later in a crowded military tent with a shattered shoulder and no memory of the battle that nearly ended his life. Months passed before Daniel could even stand again, and by the time he learned the army believed him dead, the war had already scattered his regiment across distant states, leaving him stranded among strangers who urged him to start a new life somewhere east, where no one knew his name. But Daniel refused every suggestion with the stubborn patience of a man whose heart belonged to a single place on earth. And the moment his strength returned, he began the long journey back toward the prairie, riding borrowed horses, walking when he had to, working odd ranch jobs along the trail to earn enough money for supplies. And through every mile he carried one memory brighter than all the rest, the image of Clara standing beside the train platform, clutching his sleeve, while the whistle screamed and smoke filled the sky. Years slipped past like drifting sand during that journey, because healing from war was never as simple as crossing miles on a map. And sometimes Daniel had to stop for weeks at a time when old wounds refused to cooperate, while other days he woke from nightmares that dragged him back into the thunder of battlefields he wished he could forget. Yet every time doubt crept into his mind, he reached into his pocket, where the twin of Clara's silver coin rested, the one he had kept for himself as a reminder that promises were not things a man abandoned halfway across the world. And that coin became his compass through the darkest nights, guiding him west the same way the North Star guides wandering cowboys across an endless sky. Now as Daniel Mercer rode slowly through the edge of Red Hollow beneath the fading light of sunset, his eyes drifted upward toward the hill where the prairie grass moved like waves beneath the wind. And there he saw something that made his heart stop beating for a moment, a simple wooden cross standing alone against the sky with a figure beside it. A woman wrapped in a coat he knew better than his own shadow, and though distance kept her face hidden, the shape of her silhouette struck him harder than any bullet ever had, because no man forgets the outline of the woman he loves. And Daniel pulled gently on the reins as his horse slowed to a quiet walk, his breath catching in his throat, while the realization crept over him like dawn after a long night. Clara Whitmore had never stopped waiting. The wind rolled softly across the prairie as twilight settled over Red Hollow, turning the sky into a wide blanket of fading gold and deepening blue, and Daniel Mercer guided his weary horse slowly toward the hill where the lonely wooden cross stood against the horizon, his heart pounding harder with every step the horse climbed through the tall grass, because the figure beside that cross had not moved away the way most folks would after sunset, and even from a distance he could see the shape of Daniel's old coat wrapped around her shoulders, the same coat he had left behind years ago on the morning he rode to war, and the sight of it struck him like a memory so powerful he nearly forgot how to breathe, because a man may travel half the world and survive battles and storms, but the moment he sees the woman he loves waiting for him where he left her, every mile of the journey suddenly feels worth the pain it took to return. Clara Whitmore stood beside the cross, gripping the silver coin in her hand as the rider approached through the dim light, and though her mind tried to remind her of every traveler who had passed through Red Hollow before, her heart refused to listen, because the way the man held the reins, the way he leaned forward in the saddle with quiet patience, and even the rhythm of the horse's slow steps across the hill stirred memories too strong to ignore. And as the rider came closer, she felt the world around her grow strangely quiet, the wind softening and the prairie holding its breath, as if the land itself wanted to witness what was about to happen. And when the man finally stopped a few yards away and lifted his head beneath the shadow of his hat, Clara felt the years of waiting rush through her chest like a river breaking free from a dam. For a moment neither of them spoke, because some truths arrived too heavy for words, and Daniel Mercer slowly swung his leg from the saddle and stepped down onto the grass, his boots touching the soil of home for the first time in years, and Clara stared at him with eyes wide and shining as if she feared the image might vanish like smoke if she blinked too quickly. And though time had carved deeper lines into Daniel's face and the war had left its quiet scars upon his posture, there was no mistaking the man standing before her, the same steady gaze, the same calm strength she had known beneath the cottonwood tree by the river all those years ago. And Daniel finally spoke her name in a voice roughened by distance and memory, a single word carried across the quiet hill like a prayer finally answered. Clara's hand trembled as she opened her fingers to reveal the silver coin he had given her the day he left, its surface glinting faintly beneath the fading light, and Daniel reached into his pocket to pull out the matching coin he had carried across battlefields and dusty trails, holding it between his fingers with a small, almost disbelieving smile. And when their eyes met again, the years of silence melted away in that single shared understanding, because promises made beneath open skies have a way of surviving even the cruelest storms. And Clara took a step forward before another tear could fall, while Daniel closed the distance between them with the slow certainty of a man who had spent half his life traveling toward that moment. And when they finally embraced beside the wooden cross, the prairie wind lifted gently around them as though the land itself sighed with relief. Down in Red Hollow, the townsfolk had begun to notice the rider climbing the hill earlier that evening, and curiosity pulled a few of them toward the edge of town where they could see the lonely cross, silhouetted against the fading sky. And Samuel Briggs the blacksmith was among the first to recognize what was happening, his jaw slowly dropping open as the two figures on the hill stepped toward one another. And though distance kept their voices from reaching the town, there was no mistaking the meaning of that quiet reunion, because even from far away it was clear the woman who had waited beside that cross for years was no longer alone. And Samuel removed his hat slowly, while a stunned smile spread across his soot-covered face, whispering to the men beside him that sometimes faith turned out to be stronger than the truth people believed. Word traveled quickly through Red Hollow that night, faster than horses and louder than any saloon rumor the town had ever heard, because the man everyone believed dead had returned like a ghost, walking calmly out of the past. And before long, lanterns flickered along the streets as people stepped outside their homes to look toward the hill, where two small silhouettes still stood beside the cross beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. And even old Sheriff Thomas Hale rode out to see for himself, guiding his horse through the tall grass until he stopped at the base of the hill with quiet respect, because he understood that some moments belonged to the people living them, and the reunion of Clara Whitmore and Daniel Mercer was one of those rare moments the world should not interrupt. Later that night, Clara and Daniel finally walked down the hill together, their steps slow but steady as they carried the wooden cross with them, because Clara had built it during a time when the world believed Daniel Mercer had fallen forever. And now that he had returned, there was no need for a grave marker standing lonely against the sky. And the townsfolk gathered near the road, watched in silence as the two figures approached beneath the lantern glow, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief, while others wiped quiet tears from their eyes. And Samuel Briggs stepped forward first, with a laugh that cracked through the still air like thunder after a drought, wrapping Daniel in a rough embrace, while declaring that Red Hollow had just witnessed the stubborn power of a promise. In the years that followed, the story of the woman who waited beside a cross spread far beyond the dusty borders of Red Hollow, carried by travelers who claimed they had seen the hill where love refused to surrender to war or time. And Clara Whitmore and Daniel Mercer built a quiet life together on a small ranch near the river where cottonwood trees whispered through warm summer nights, while the old wooden cross remained, carefully placed beside their barn as a reminder of the faith that had carried them through the darkest years. And sometimes when the sun set across the prairie, Daniel would sit beside Clara on the porch, watching the horizon with a gentle smile, because he knew better than anyone that somewhere in the world there were still promises waiting to be kept. And in Red Hollow everyone remembered the woman who waited, and the man who finally came home.